Hello and welcome to the long-term reading project in which we will discuss a section of Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain every week. And if this is the first video that you're watching on this channel, I recommend watching my introductory video first, in which I describe why it is worth reading this novel, which is over 100 years old, and also how this project is going to be organized. And of course, I would also recommend the video in which I discuss the first chapter. In short, in these weekly videos, I will not give a summary of the respective section, but I will rather assume that you have already read it. But what I would like to do is to share my observations and thoughts with you that have come to me while reading the novel or while doing some research, but also questions or problems that I have encountered while reading and that you may be able to help me with. And this project is not at all intended to be an academic seminar. It is a project by a hobby reader for other hobby readers. And I certainly don't have the one and only correct interpretation, but I'm looking forward to your additions, your questions or objections in the comments or by email. This week we have read the second chapter of the Zauberberg, The Magic Mountain, which offers a flashback of the early history of Hans Castorp. And he was orphaned at a very early age and grew up first with his grandfather, the Hamburg senator Hans Lorenz Castorp, and then with his uncle, Consul Tinapel. So senators and consuls are members of the upper middle class or upper class. So Hans Castorp lives in very secure economic conditions, which is also reflected in his love of the good life. And here are a few visual impressions of the places mentioned in the novel. The Castorp's house is built in the Nordic classicist style, and it may have looked like this. This is not a poor man's house, you will notice. And the Tinapels live on the Harvestehuder Weg, which is an avenue of wealthy townhouses. And he likes to sit by the water and look over Uhlenhorst. That's a place that looks like this. And he likes to take breakfast at the Ulster Pavilion with smoked meat and old porter. He appreciates good cigars, and he's extremely careful in selecting and maintaining, keeping proper his clothing, with a tendency to eccentricity, because he believes that outside of Hamburg, there's no one who can do a proper ironing of clothes. And I think that at least in these superficialities, in these matters of the outward appearance, Thomas Mann has put some of his own characteristics as a young man into Hans Castorp, with some sort of a tongue-in-cheek approach. Photos of Thomas Mann at the age of Hans Castorp at the time of his journey to the Magic Mountain also show a young man who is dressed with the utmost accuracy in accordance with the elegant fashion of the well-off of his time. But leaving aside these superficialities, what do we learn about Hans' character and personality development? The first thing that strikes me is that the motive of contradictions and the upheaval of times, which we saw in the first chapter, is taken up again here. On the one hand, Hans Castorp is fascinated by the past and by the outward forms of a bourgeois life. He values the bourgeois order and culture and their roots and tradition. And he particularly admires his grandfather for his antiquated ways, but also for the elegance, the way he eats with such care, and the elegant antiquated collar he wears. And Hans also loves this ritual that his grandfather carries out somewhat pedantically, showing him the old christening basin. It's pedantic in the small gestures, because the Rococo case in Palisander Wood is locked, and the key is not in the lock, but in the grandfather's pocket on a keyring. And the glass panes of the Rococo case are covered with yellow silk curtains. And so it's really a ritual to get through it. And Hans is fascinated by the thought that this christening basin connects a whole chain of generations. And so on the one hand, there is this strong affinity of Hans with the past, but on the other hand, at the time he travels to Davos, all his connections to the past have been severed. Both of his parents are dead, the grandfather is dead, he is more or less rootless. And Hans, we learn about his character that he has a very difficult opinion on work. On the one hand, he does approve of the Protestant work ethics, of work as an ethical and social, even religious duty. But he is not the type to work continuously in a focused way. He tends to daydream. When he looks at the christening basin, for example, he feels transported into sacred places, which he imagines very vividly and even with sounds. And also in these daydreams, we see that the contradictions that are present everywhere. When he thinks about the christening basin, he has to think of places associated with death and burial. Christening is a ritual at the beginning of life, but he thinks of death and burial, but he finds this soothing, and he can believe that he can hear the hush of echoing places, which is also sort of contradictory. The hush is nothing that we can hear, and he has the feeling of change in the midst of duration, of time as both flowing and persisting, of recurrence in continuity. So there's a lot of contradictory elements here entwined together. And like his grandfather, who, I quote, had held far more with ancestral ways and old institutions than with ruinous schemes for widening the harbor or godless and rubbishing plans for a great metropolis. Hans also feels a connection to his grandfather's way of thinking. The narrator speaks of a sort of a natural sympathy and essential intimacy. And even as a child, Hans tends towards some metaphysical speculation. So he does not consider the everyday appearance of his grandfather to be his true and real nature, the true and real one. Even as a child, he can have such abstract thoughts that there's something like a metaphysical idea or essence behind the physical, imperfect appearance of his grandfather. But despite this intellectual rooting in the past and in the metaphysical, Hans pursues a career that is fully characterized by rationalism and a belief in progress. And that's sort of weird. He becomes a ship engineer, which is about the most sober and rationalist and progressive thing you could do in his generation, when the great age of shipbuilding and shipping began with ever larger and faster steamships. Remember, this is just a few years before Titanic was built. But here too, further contradictions shimmer beneath the surface. He does not consciously and purposefully choose this career. It is more by chance. It is suggested to him by others, like his great uncle. So he stumbles into this into this university study, more or less by chance, just as he stumbles into this trip to Davos, more or less by chance, driven by suggestions made by his doctor and by his great uncle. And this character trait is already described at the funeral of his great-grandfather, where it is said that Hans was, I quote, was unaware of the practical results the loss would mean to his life, or else, with childlike indifference, was instinctively confident that he would be taken care of somehow. And we also see some of his character contradictions in his inclination towards shipbuilding. The narrator reports that Hans' fascination with shipbuilding was already evident in his childhood drawings, but the most successful thing in any of the pictures Hans painted as a child was not the ship, but, I quote, the glassy green rolling waves. And even in the technical drawings that he has to do as a shipbuilding engineer, the real important technical details were not quite as good. But, I quote, wherever it was in place to call in the sense perceptions to help out the intellectual, wherever he could wash in the shadows or lay on the cross-sections in the conventional colors, there Hans Castorp showed more dexterity than most. And in general, his relationship to work is also a divided, contradictory one. I quote, he had the greatest respect for work, though personally he found that he tired easily. Or, it is described just one page later, that his work stood somewhat in the way of his unclouded enjoyment of his Maria Mancini, which is his favorite sort of cigar. So again, we have this tension. On the one hand, he identifies with the Protestant work ethic and the Protestant duty ethics of his grandfather, who is explicitly characterized as a pious Christian and a dutiful citizen. On the other hand, he is sensitive and a dreamy nature, and there's his tendency to lazy, pleasurable dozing, and this gets in the way of doing hard and systematic work. So intellectually, he was, I quote, neither genius nor dunderhead. So he was average, mediocre. So what we also do know, or can calculate from the dates given in the novel, is Hans was born around 1884 because he's 23 years old in 1907 when he sets off on his journey to the Magic Mountain. And we all know that he was absolutely mediocre or average in his intellectual abilities, which also applies to his university degree, which he completed, I quote, respectably, but without any fanfare or trumpets. So, to summarize, what we learn in this chapter about the character of Hans can be described more or less as follows. It's a young, wealthy, sensitive, and somewhat spoiled young man, well off, but of average talent. On the one hand, intellectually rooted in the past. On the other hand, without personal ties to the past. And as almost all his reference persons have died without any strong relations at all. And in a progress-oriented profession that is in conflict with his rather artistic talent. He's a daydreamer and a bon vivant who is rather aimless and a bit disoriented, and who, like the society in which he lives, is in sort of a transitional or threshold situation. The further development of it's not really clear to him. The explicitly mentioned mediocrity of Hans and the fact that he also carries many contradictions with him, just as the society in which he lives is characterized by contradictions and a lack of orientation, this makes him an exemplary representative of his time and his society. And I think this already tells us what Thomas Mann intends to do with his novel and this main character. He wants to show us something typical of this societal upheaval and show it in Hans Castorp. I think the narrator also says this in a somewhat cryptic form in the long theoretical paragraph that begins with the words, I quote, "A man lives not only his personal life as an individual, but also, consciously or unconsciously, the life of his epoch and his contemporaries." And there follow a few more rather theoretical sentences. I won't quote them all here for reasons of time. However, I believe that this section is a programmatic section. It's key to understanding the novel, and it's worth reading it very carefully a second time. That brings us to the second main point of my thoughts and observation on the second chapter and the other important topics that are touched here. There are a few of them. The first one is the theme of inner contradiction and inner conflict, which we already know from the first chapter and from everything that I already told about the second chapter. The second is the contradiction between tradition and progress, between old and new philosophies and ideas. And the third major theme is the dual nature of human appearance, the external, what we see every day, and an abstract, almost metaphysical idea behind it as the essential, the intrinsic, the real part of the personality. And fourthly, and I think most importantly, the theme of death, of passing, is really omnipresent. This is the case both in the form of the extinction and death of old ideas, when it's described that the burial of the grandfather also marks the end of an entire area, but also in the concrete form of individual human death. And I find it interesting to note that death almost always appears here in the form of lung diseases. The mother died of an embolism after giving birth, and these post-birth embolisms are usually pulmonary embolisms. Both Hans' father and grandfather died of pneumonia, and his cousin Joachim Ziemßen suffers from tuberculosis. So just like the christening basin, which connects many generations of the Castorps in a kind of chain, I got the impression that also lung diseases seem to be something like a family tradition or a chain just that is connecting the family members. But death also flashes up in unexpected places from time to time. So it's sometimes easy to miss. For example, in the grandfather's Rococo case, which is actually only used to store very valuable, precious old objects. There's also a rat trap somewhere in there, which is a death-bringing instrument. And on a purely objective level, it makes no sense at all that such an object would be stored in this cupboard. But I read this as a clever game on the part of the narrator, reminding us, even in this episode, which is about baptism as an important ritual at the beginning of life, he reminds us not to forget the omnipresence and the suddenness of death by making reference to a rat trap. As a final point, I would like to discuss a specific narrative device or narrative feature that I noticed, or rather two of them. The first one is the symbolism of numbers, and I think we will encounter this again and again. In particular, the number 7 appears in several places in this chapter, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden, and, spoiler alert, it will be a recurring theme throughout the novel. The number 7 has a special significance in biblical symbolism as a divine, perfect number. Just think of the 7 days of creation, the 7 plagues in Egypt, the menorah with its 7 arms and candles. And to name just a few examples of the novel, in the year that Hans lives with his grandfather, he's 7 years old, and if you count the number of generations that are engraved on the plate of the christening basin, you will also notice that there are exactly 7 generations that are engraved here. I don't want to give away any more examples. I don't want to spoil the fun of searching and discovering for you. I think there will be in the future a more in-depth video looking at the symbolism of numbers in the Magic Mountain, more in general and in more detail. Yeah, the second thing that I noticed is something that I don't know how to call it correctly with a proper technical term in literature science. I call it a constant technique of revealing and concealing, or revelation and concealment. I will explain in a minute. In retrospect, I can see that Thomas Mann uses this also in the first chapter, but I really only noticed it here in the second chapter, and I'm curious to see how this technique will develop further in the novel. What I mean by that is that I see many examples in the text of something negative, disturbing, threatening, or anesthetic, disgusting, being reported, being described. But the negative aesthetic effect is immediately mitigated by the fact that the negative is immediately veiled, it's concealed or beautified again by adding some other element to it. This begins in the very first chapter. There are some threatening looking rocks, but they are veiled in fog, in mist. The sick people on the Magic Mountain, they have to collect their sputum in a bottle. So this certainly looks anesthetic, the sputum. But this bottle is made of dark blue glass so that you can't see the disgusting, or you don't have to see the disgusting stuff. And it's even called by a cute nickname, Blue Henry. The grandfather likes to use snuff, but there are red handkerchiefs used so that somewhat conceal the anesthetic traces of snuff. And Hans has bad teeth or rotten teeth, but they have been restored with gold fillings. And after the death of the grandfather, the corpse already smells a little, so it attracts a fly, but it is surrounded by tuberoses, which are intensely scented white flowers that mask the bad smell of the corpse. And I find this a very interesting narrative technique, which for me, maybe it's stretching the point too far, but for me it is something almost programmatic, like a philosophy of life. That is, the ugly, the anesthetic, the disturbing is not ignored. It's not concealed in the beginning. It is named, it's identified, but it is again then softened, beautified, almost transformed, brought into a bearable form by artistic means. And I think this also points to a possible function of art as a coping strategy or a survival strategy with all the difficult stuff that we have to encounter in life. So these were my observations and thoughts on the second chapter. For me, it really confirmed the impression I had when reading the first chapter. We are dealing with an incredibly dense prose here, in which there are very few narrative fillers. There's no filler material. Instead, every sentence, every statement seems well thought and carefully crafted, carefully placed, meaningful. Well, there are many examples of how even in very short insertions or seemingly trivial side remarks, at a closer look, there are several levels of meaning, several layers of meaning and significance. So it really is a novel that is perfectly suited for a slow reading and close reading project. I'll stop here for today. I'm looking forward to your comments, and I hope you will join me next week. Unfortunately, next week there will not be a video on the Magic Mountain next Sunday. I'm sorry, I have to attend a burial service of a distant relative, and it's also distant in spatial terms. It means 2 days of travel to get there and to get back. So the next video on the Magic Mountain will go online on Sunday, the 1st of September, and it will cover the entire third chapter of the novel. If you get bored in the meantime, feel free to drop by my main channel. For those who don't know it yet, it's called Polyglot Reading. I'll put the link here and in the info box below. So thank you so much for watching this video. Have a great reading time. Take care and bye.